When nature collides with human failure, disaster doesn't just strike, it amplifies into a catastrophe. In March 2025, Myanmar was hit by one of the most devastating earthquakes of the decade, 7.7 to 7.9 magnitude, and it wasn't just the tremors that caused the damage. The engineering failures and poorly constructed buildings turned what could have been a tragic event into an unprecedented infrastructure collapse. In seconds, bridges were swallowed by rivers, expressways were reduced to rubble, hospitals turned into graves, and centuries-old temples crumbled to dust. Thousands of lives lost, entire communities vanished, $11 billion in structural damage. This wasn't just a natural disaster, it was the result of decades of neglect. Poor construction, inadequate regulations, and a lack of earthquake-resistant design left Myanmar vulnerable to nature's fury. Today we'll break down what happened, why it happened, and how we can prevent such tragedies in the future. Stick with us as we dive into the shocking collapse that was a tragic mix of nature and human failure. The earthquake itself. Let's start with the event that triggered it all, the earthquake. In March 2025, Myanmar's northern region was struck by a massive earthquake that shook the country to its core. The epicenter was in the Himalayas, not far from Myanmar's borders with China and India, sending shockwaves across the entire region. Measuring between 7.7 to 7.9 on the Richter scale, this was no ordinary quake. The shaking lasted several minutes but left its devastating mark in just seconds. Buildings crumbled, land was split, bridges, roads, hospitals, and homes collapsed like a house of cards. Entire cities were rendered uninhabitable in the blink of an eye. Eyewitnesses recall seeing massive fissures splitting the ground, swallowing whole villages. Emergency services struggled to reach those trapped under the rubble. Local hospitals, already overwhelmed, were no match for the influx of injured survivors. And aftershocks continued to rock the country, hampering rescue efforts. The aftermath was chaotic. Tens of thousands of people were left without homes, food, or medical care. The official death toll reached into the thousands, with many more critically injured. But the story doesn't end there. The $11 billion collapse. In the aftermath, the true scale of the destruction became apparent: $11 billion in damages. But how do you put a price tag on the devastation caused by such a catastrophic event? Infrastructure collapse was the biggest contributor to the staggering cost. Let's break it down. Bridges that connected major cities were wiped off the map. The Irrawaddy River Bridge, a key transportation link, was completely destroyed, cutting off vital routes for aid and recovery efforts. Expressways that stretched across Myanmar were torn apart, stranding travelers and halting supply chains. Hospitals and schools, places that were meant to shelter and protect, were obliterated, rendering local resources almost useless. And then there were the cultural losses. Temples, some dating back to ancient times, collapsed into ruins. Myanmar's rich history and heritage, intertwined with its architecture, were now irreparably damaged. The loss of life was compounded by these cultural and historical losses. But why does this earthquake stand out? For one, it was the fragility of the infrastructure that made the damage so extreme. Countries like Japan, Chile, and California have built resilience into their infrastructure, but Myanmar, unfortunately, had not. What could have been a tragedy turned into a human-made disaster due to decades of poor building practices and lack of enforcement. Human tragedy. Behind the staggering numbers, there's an even more heartbreaking truth: the human cost. The immediate toll on human life was devastating. Survivors who had witnessed their homes collapse were left with little more than the clothes on their backs. Families were torn apart as parents frantically searched for missing children in the wreckage. The elderly, disabled, and the very young were the most vulnerable, with many left trapped in their homes as rescue operations faltered. For those lucky enough to survive the initial quake, they now face survival mode. Shelter, food, water, and medicine were in short supply. The infrastructure collapse compounded the crisis, leaving communities isolated. Roads were blocked, airports were damaged, hospitals couldn't accommodate the injured. The international response was swift, but the damage was too widespread. UN aid, relief teams, and neighboring countries like India and Thailand rushed to help, but the process was slow and the damage was already done. The human toll went beyond just immediate deaths. Thousands were left homeless, without the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. Entire towns were erased. Communities that had lived together for generations were forced to start over from scratch. The effects of the earthquake will be felt for years, if not decades. Engineering failures. Let's take a step back and ask the most important question: why did this disaster become so catastrophic? The answer lies in engineering failures that are all too common in developing nations that lack the resources to enforce safety standards. The primary issue: Myanmar's building codes were outdated and poorly enforced. In many cases, buildings weren't designed to withstand seismic forces. The construction materials used were substandard. Cheap concrete and improperly mixed cement weakened the structural integrity of buildings. Buildings that were supposed to protect people instead became death traps. Hospitals, schools, and apartment buildings crumbled because they were never designed with earthquake resistance in mind. Unlike countries like Japan or Chile, where infrastructure is built to withstand severe earthquakes, Myanmar's construction industry simply didn't have the necessary safeguards in place. The lack of seismic retrofitting and disaster preparedness left the country vulnerable to nature's wrath. Lessons for the world. Myanmar's experience serves as a case study, and the lessons here are clear. If we don't act now, we could be looking at another disaster waiting to happen. The world needs to realize that we can't keep building the same way. As the global population grows and more people live in earthquake-prone regions, the risks of such a catastrophe increase. The lessons learned from Myanmar's collapse should act as a wake-up call. Countries must invest in disaster-resistant infrastructure. They must modernize building codes, enforce regulations, and ensure that construction practices are up to date. This is not just about saving money, it's about saving lives. The future lies in building for resilience, not just for expansion. Engineers, architects, and policymakers need to come together and plan for the unexpected. We can no longer afford to ignore the long-term risks of natural disasters. The global warning. Myanmar is a clear warning. The fragility of infrastructure is a global issue. The risks are everywhere, especially in developing countries where urbanization is growing rapidly. And it's not just about earthquakes. There are floods, hurricanes, and other natural disasters that can hit at any time. The $11 billion damage in Myanmar is just a glimpse of what could happen elsewhere. Imagine the economic toll if a similar event occurred in a densely populated, economically vital city. Entire economies could collapse, entire populations could be displaced. This is a global issue. The truth is, no matter where you live, be it in a wealthy city like New York or a developing city like Yangon, you're at risk if infrastructure isn't built to withstand the forces of nature. The next time a disaster strikes, it may not just be the immediate aftermath that's devastating, it's the years of recovery that follow. Myanmar's lessons must be taken to heart by every nation. The 2025 Myanmar earthquake wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe fueled by decades of poor engineering, infrastructure neglect, and a lack of disaster preparedness. This was a stark reminder that while nature can be unforgiving, it's the human choices or failures that determine the scale of the destruction. When nature's fury combines with human error, the consequences are nothing short of tragic. The $11 billion collapse of infrastructure was just the tip of the iceberg. It's the countless lives lost, families torn apart, and entire communities wiped off the map that make this event even more heart-wrenching. For the people of Myanmar, the loss isn't just in terms of money, it's the lifelong scars left on the survivors who are now forced to rebuild their homes, their lives, and their sense of security from the ground up. But this isn't just about Myanmar, it's about every nation that underestimates the impact of weak infrastructure. The devastation was amplified by the lack of seismic-resistant buildings. Buildings that should have protected the people inside were the very structures that became death traps. When cities like Yangon, Mandalay, and others were hit, the underlying issue wasn't just the strength of the earthquake, it was the fragility of the infrastructure that couldn't withstand the forces of nature. We can no longer afford to ignore these warnings. The lesson is clear. We cannot wait for the next disaster to make the changes we know are necessary. In today's world where urbanization is rapidly expanding, especially in earthquake-prone regions, we must act now to make sure we're not sitting ducks for the next major disaster. Every year, more people are being exposed to the risk of natural disasters as cities grow. And while the technology and resources exist to protect these cities, political will and investment are often the barriers that stand in our way. The global community must act immediately, not just for the sake of those in disaster-prone areas, but for the safety and future of every citizen on this planet. The call for smart design, earthquake-resistant infrastructure, and better building practices has never been more urgent. We have the tools, we have the technology, and we have the knowledge, but the world needs to make the commitment to build for resilience. It's about redesigning our cities, retraining our engineers, and reassessing our policies. Cities don't have to be fragile in the face of earthquakes or floods. We can make smart choices that protect lives while keeping up with the demands of modern urbanization. Myanmar's collapse is a wake-up call for the world. Will we learn from it, or will we continue to ignore the glaring risks of inadequate infrastructure? How many more lives will be lost before we decide that enough is enough? We stand at a crossroads in history, and the decisions we make today will shape the cities of tomorrow. If we don't act now, future generations will pay the price, not just in the form of loss of life, but in economic losses that could dwarf the $11 billion Myanmar has already endured. If you've watched this far, you know how crucial these lessons are for the world we live in. The devastation in Myanmar may have been an isolated incident, but the underlying issues are universal. Whether you're in a city that is prone to earthquakes, flooding, or other natural disasters, the message is clear. We must start building with resilience in mind. The world cannot afford to wait until the next tragedy. We must act now. To learn more about how infrastructure breakdowns impact the world, how we can build smarter, and how we can make sure this never happens again, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date on more stories like this and to get actionable insights on how we can change the future for the better. Let's make sure the next generation doesn't inherit the same risks we are facing today. Together, we can build smarter, stronger, and safer cities for everyone. Join us in the conversation.